My hand landed on the cold brass handle at the exact same second hers did. In the chaos of the flea market, that overwhelming wash of haggling voices and the scent of damp wool, the world suddenly narrowed down to a single point of contact. It wasn't just the shock of warm skin against mine, it was the immediate, terrifying spark of recognition in her eyes when I looked up. We stood there, frozen over a battered rosewood case, neither of us willing to let go. The challenge wasn't spoken. It was right there in the way she held my gaze, stripping away the crowd until it was just us. The morning air was thick, clinging to the rows of folding tables with a damp persistence. It smelled of old paper, rust, and the impending threat of rain. I had been scanning the stalls for an hour, my archivist's eye filtering out the mass-produced junk, looking for the one thing worth saving. And I found it. A mid-century drafting case, rosewood, scarred, but structurally sound. It was the kind of piece that held secrets in its joinery. I reached for it with the reverence of someone who restores history for a living, but I wasn't fast enough. Her hand was already there, not hovering, but claiming. Her fingers were long, the knuckles dusted with something that looked like charcoal or dark grease. Where my hands are trained for delicate paper and dissolving glue, hers were built for leverage and force. I tried to pull the case toward me, just a fraction of an inch. She didn't budge. The leather handle might as well have been bolted to the table. "I think you'll find I have possession," she said. Her voice was low, a rough texture that seemed to vibrate through the wood connecting us. "Possession isn't ownership," I countered, keeping my voice steady, though my pulse had already jumped into my throat. And I saw it from the aisle. "Seeing isn't holding?" She didn't smile. She didn't frown either. She just watched me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and completely unbothered by the social contract that says you apologize when you bump into a stranger. She occupied the space between us without apology, her stance wide, grounded in heavy boots that had seen years of job sites. I looked down at our hands. The contrast was stark, my pale, unmarred skin against her weather-beaten grip. It was a visual representation of the friction between theory and practice, between preserving the past and building the present. The tension coiled tight in my chest. It wasn't anger, it was something sharper, more volatile. "It's locked," I said, pointing to the brass mechanism. "You don't have the key." "I can pick a lock," she replied, her thumb brushing against the back of my hand. It was accidental, surely, but the sensation lingered, hot and distracting. "Or I can replace it." "It's a complex dual lever mechanism," I said, the technical jargon slipping out as a defense. "You force it, you shatter the internal spring, you ruin the piece." She tilted her head, reevaluating me. "You know the make?" "I know the maker," I corrected, "and I know how to open it without destroying it." The vendor, an older man in a knitted cap, took a nervous half-step back. He looked between us, sensing the air had shifted from a simple transaction to a territorial dispute. He cleared his throat, clearly wanting the sale but wanting to avoid the crossfire more. "Ladies," he started, "I have another one in the van." "No," we said in unison. The silence that followed stretched, heavy and thick. She smelled faintly of cedar and strong, black coffee. It was intoxicating in a way I wasn't prepared for. I wanted the box. I needed the box for the collection. But suddenly, the objective had shifted. "I'll give you 50, she said to the vendor, never breaking eye contact with me. It was 20 over the sticker price. "Sold," the man said, relieved. She pulled a wad of cash from her pocket with her free hand, the one not locking me in place on the handle, and slapped it on the table. The transaction was over, before I could even reach for my wallet. She had won the object. But as she finally loosened her grip, allowing me to pull my hand back, the look she gave me suggested the negotiation was just beginning. She picked up the case, the leather creaking under the weight, and didn't walk away. She just stood there, the heavy rosewood tucked under her arm like it weighed nothing, waiting for me to make the next move. The air between us was still vibrating, the dust motes dancing in the space where our hands had touched. My blood was humming, a high-frequency vibration under my skin that had nothing to do with the caffeine I'd missed this morning. Losing a bid usually felt like a hollow thud in the gut, a simple disappointment of the hunt, but this felt sharp, electric. I watched her walk away, the box tucked under her arm like she owned the world, and the frustration was a physical heat in my chest. It was deeply irritating the way she moved, efficient, grounded, taking up space with an ease I envied. But she didn't disappear into the crowd. She walked 10 paces, cleared the press of bodies near the stall, and then she stopped. She didn't turn around, she just waited. It was an arrogant move, assuming I would follow. And the worst part was, she was completely right. I closed the distance between us, my boots crunching on the loose gravel of the sidewalk. The noise of the market faded slightly here, replaced by the distant rush of the highway and the chatter of pedestrians. When I reached her, she turned, leaning back against a brick wall, the drafting case resting against her hip. The morning sun caught the sharp angle of her jaw, highlighting the fine grain of her skin. She looked comfortable in the silence, unhurried, while I felt like a live wire snapping in the wind. "You overpaid," I said. It was petty, a small jab to regain some footing, but it was the only weapon I had left. "I paid for convenience," she replied, her voice still holding that rough, low texture that scraped against my nerves in the most pleasant way possible. "Now, I don't have to argue with you. I have the box, you have your money. Everyone wins." "You have a locked box, Abigail," I said, the name on the receipt the vendor had handed her sticking in my mind. "And you have no idea how to get inside without turning 80-year-old rosewood into kindling." She raised an eyebrow, shifting her weight. The movement was fluid, confident. "I have a workshop full of tools that say otherwise. Wood yields if you know where to apply the pressure." "Not this wood," I countered, crossing my arms. I needed to regain the high ground. She had the object, but I held the map. "It's a gravity latch, customized for architectural transport in the 40s. If you try to pry it or drill the lock core, a secondary deadbolt engages. It seals permanently. You'll have a very expensive, very heavy paperweight, and you'll destroy the provenance." She studied me then, really studied me. Her gaze dropped from my eyes to my hands, then back up, slow and deliberate. It felt like being measured, or perhaps assessed for structural integrity. The air between us thickened, charged with something that wasn't about antique joinery at all. It was the friction of competence, recognizing competence. "You know the trick," she stated. "It wasn't a question." "I do. And I have the box." We seemed to be at an impasse. She pushed off the wall, the distance between us shrinking. "Or a partnership." She gestured with her head toward a battered pickup truck parked at the curb. "My studio is 10 minutes from here, east side. I have the tools. You have the know-how. We open it together, split whatever is inside." I looked at the truck, then I looked at her. Every safety instinct I had honed, living in the city, was screaming, "Don't get in the vehicle. Don't go to the second location." It was reckless. It was stupid. But then she looked me in the eye, and that same spark I'd felt when our hands touched flared again. It was a pull, undeniable and heavy, like a tide dragging me out past the breakers. I was going because the tension coiling in my stomach demanded a resolution. "If you're an axe murderer," I said, trying to keep my voice light, "I'm going to be very disappointed in my judgment." The corner of her mouth quirked up, barely a smile, but it changed her whole face. I'm a carpenter. Axes are for people who lack finesse. She unlocked the passenger door. I climbed up into the cab, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The outside world was cut off. The interior smelled intensely of pine shavings, old leather, and that dark, rich coffee scent that seemed to cling to her skin. It was a masculine, grounded smell, overwhelming in the small space. The seat was worn smooth, molding to my body. As she climbed in the driver's side, the cab shrank. She was broad-shouldered, filling the space, her presence a tangible weight beside me. She put the key in the ignition, but didn't turn it immediately. She just sat there for a second, her hand resting on the gear stick, looking at me. Ready, she asked. Drive, I said, my voice sounding breathier than I intended. The truck engine cut out, and the silence that followed was heavy, immediate, and profound. We were parked in front of a converted industrial complex, the kind of red brick behemoth that used to manufacture textiles, but now mostly housed artists, silence, and dust. The ride over had been quiet, filled only with the hum of the tires and the static charge of two people trying not to look at each other while desperately wanting to do nothing else. Now the stillness felt like a held breath. Abigail didn't say a word. She just grabbed the rosewood case from the seat between us, opened her door, and stepped out into the gray light of the alley. I followed, the gravel crunching loud under my boots. There was a shift in the air here, away from the frenetic energy of the market. It was slower, deeper. She unlocked a heavy steel door with a keychain that jingled sharply in the quiet and swung it open, holding it for me. It wasn't a gesture of chivalry, it was a challenge. Step into my world. I crossed the threshold, and the smell hit me instantly. It was richer here than in the truck. A complex layering of sawdust, linseed oil, turpentine, and the metallic tang of sharpened steel. It smelled like work. It smelled like patience. She flipped a bank of switches, and the overhead industrial lights flickered on with a low buzz, illuminating a space that was less a studio and more a cathedral to manual labor. The ceilings were 20 feet high, lost in shadow, but the floor was a landscape of purpose. There were racks of clamps lined up like soldiers, shelves, floor to ceiling with lumber, sorted by grain and species, and massive cast iron machinery that looked like it could crush a car or plane a violin. It was chaotic to the untrained eye, but to me, it was a map of her mind. Everything had a place. Everything was within reach. Workbench is back here, she said, her voice absorbing into the vastness of the room. I followed her through the maze of projects, a half-finished dining table in walnut, a set of chairs waiting for upholstery, a pile of raw oak planks. We reached a massive central table, its surface scarred and stained from years of use. This was the altar. This was where the magic happened. She set the drafting case down in the center of a clear space. The sound of the wood settling against the heavy bench was a dull, solid thud that seemed to close the door on the outside world completely. The city traffic was just a distant memory now. Here, the only sound was the hum of a refrigerator in the corner and the rustle of fabric as Abigail shrugged out of her heavy canvas jacket. I watched, unable to look away, as she tossed the coat onto a nearby stool. Underneath, she wore a dark gray thermal shirt that clung to her frame, practical and worn thin at the elbows. "It's warm in here," she muttered, though the air was cool. She began to roll up her sleeves. It was a mundane action, something I'd seen 1,000 people do, but the way she did it made my mouth go dry. She was methodical, folding the fabric over itself with precise, jerky movements. As the gray cotton climbed her forearms, the reality of her labor was revealed. Her arms were corded with muscle, defined and functional. The kind of strength you don't get from a gym, but from lifting oak beams and wrestling with iron clamps. There was a scar running along her left radius, a jagged white line against the tan skin, and her veins stood out in relief against the tension of her grip. I felt a flush rise up my neck that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was an appreciation of competence, yes, but it was also something far more primal. I was an archivist. I spent my days with fragile things, with gloves and tweezers, and breath held tight. She was the opposite. She was force and leverage and creation. She caught me staring. She didn't look away. Instead, she finished rolling the second sleeve, pushing the fabric up past her elbow, and leaned her hip against the workbench. The distance between us was maybe 3 feet. We weren't rivals fighting over a flea market find anymore. The dynamic had shifted. We were collaborators, isolated in this sanctuary of dust and light, about to open something that didn't want to be opened. "Okay," she said, her eyes locking onto mine, dark and unreadable. "Show me what you know." She reached up and pulled a chain on a hanging shop light, swinging it down so the cone of illumination focused entirely on the drafting case and on the space between our bodies. The rest of the room fell into shadow. It was just us, the box, and the terrifying electric potential of what was about to happen. We leaned in together, the overhead light casting a stark, focused cone of illumination onto the scarred workbench. The rest of the cavernous studio fell away into shadow, leaving us suspended in this pool of brightness. It felt less like a workspace and more like an interrogation room, or perhaps a confessional. The drafting case sat between us, the dark rosewood gleaming dully, but the real focal point was the sudden, overwhelming proximity of our bodies. I placed my hands on the edge of the bench to steady myself. Abigail stood right next to me, too close for a stranger, too close for a colleague. I could feel the heat radiating from her shoulder, a physical wave of warmth that seemed to seep through the heavy cotton of her thermal shirt and straight into my side. It was distracting, a magnetic pull that made it difficult to focus on the task at hand. I could hear the rhythm of her breathing, slow and steady, a counterpoint to the erratic, shallow tempo of my own pulse. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. I cleared my throat, trying to summon the cool, detached authority of my profession. The trick with these mid-century transport cases is that they were designed to look simple. The maker wanted you to think it was just a matter of force. I leaned further over the box, pointing to the brass corner reinforcements. "See this? Most people try to pry the latch here, but the mechanism is actually internal. It's a gravity-weighted system dependent on a series of counterbalances." I was using the technical language as a shield, building a wall of jargon to protect myself from the intensity of her presence. I talked about tension bars, false gates, and the specific density of old-growth rosewood. I explained the physics of the lock as if my life depended on it, because in that moment, it felt like my composure certainly did. I traced the line of the wood grain with my index finger, showing her where the hidden seam lay, trying to keep my hand from trembling. "You have to depress the pressure plate here," I explained, while simultaneously sliding the secondary pin. I glanced up, expecting to see her studying the brass fittings. She wasn't. Her head was turned, her chin resting on her hand, and she was watching me. Her gaze was heavy, unblinking, and entirely focused on my mouth. She wasn't listening to a lecture on antique joinery. She was mapping the movement of my lips. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, viscous, hard to pull into my lungs. "Finesse?" she repeated. Her voice was a low rumble, vibrating in the small space between us. She wasn't talking about the lock. She reached out then. I thought she was going to touch the box to test the mechanism I had just described. My hand was still resting on the wood, my finger pointing to the hidden catch. She moved her hand toward the same spot, but she didn't aim for the brass. Her fingers brushed against the back of my hand. It wasn't a collision, it was a graze, a deliberate friction of skin against skin. The sensation was electric, a sharp, sudden jolt that snapped up my arm and settled hot in my chest. I stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that rushed in to fill the gap was deafening. Her hand lingered there, just for a second, her pinky finger hooking slightly over mine, grounding us together on the surface of the antique. I looked up, and her eyes were locked on mine. The pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris, dark pools of intent. There was no pretense in that look, no hiding. The air around us crackled, charged with a tension that was terrified of being named. I felt exposed, stripped of my professional armor, raw and open under the weight of her attention. Then, just as the tension threatened to snap something vital inside me, she pulled back. The loss of her body heat was immediate and jarring, leaving my side feeling suddenly cold. "I need a distinct tool for that," she said, her voice rougher now. She turned away, stepping out of the circle of light and disappearing into the shadows of the workshop shelves, leaving me alone with the box and the pounding of my own heart. She returned with a tin of mineral spirits and a clean, lint-free rag. The smell was sharp, chemical, cutting through the warm scent of sawdust. It was a grounding smell, one I associated with late nights in the museum archives, trying to save something that time wanted to destroy. She didn't speak, just handed me the cloth and uncapped the tin. We started on the surface. It was a necessary ritual. You can't open a wound or a box until you've cleaned the area. I poured a little of the spirits onto the rag and began to work on the lid, moving in small, circular motions. The grime of the flea market, years of attic dust and neglect, began to lift, revealing the deep, rich oxblood color of the rosewood underneath. Restoration is a strange intimacy. You are stripping away the history of an object, the oils from 1,000 hands, the smoke from forgotten rooms, to find the truth of what it was when it was new. It's an act of excavation. And as we stood there, shoulders brushing with every movement, it felt like we were doing the same thing to each other. The polite distance of strangers was dissolving with every pass of the rag, leaving something raw and exposed underneath. I stopped scrubbing to watch her. She was working on the side panel, her movements efficient and unsparing. She didn't treat the wood like it was fragile. She treated it like it was resilient. She knew exactly how much pressure to apply to lift the dirt without bruising the grain. I watched the muscles in her forearm flex and release, the tendons shifting under the skin like cables under tension. It was mesmerizing. There was a competence there that made my own hands feel suddenly clumsy, overly cautious. "It's ready," she said, her voice dropping into the quiet space between us. She wasn't looking at the box, she was looking at my hands. "The latch," I said, my throat tight. "We have to engage the gravity pin." I moved to the front of the case. I knew the theory. I knew the diagram of the internal mechanism by heart. But theory is cold comfort when your hands are shaking. I pressed my thumbs against the brass plate, trying to find the sweet spot, the hidden lever that would disengage the deadbolt. I pushed, trying to slide the secondary pin laterally, but it wouldn't budge. It was seized, frozen by 40 years of humidity and stillness. "It's stuck," I muttered, frustration spiking. I pushed harder, my knuckles turning white. "The spring isn't catching." "You're forcing it," Abigail said. She didn't move away. She moved closer. She stepped in behind me. She didn't touch me, not yet, but I could feel the heat of her body along the entire length of my back, a solid wall of presence. The air in the room seemed to compress. "Don't push," she murmured, her breath ghosting over. The shell of my ear, sending a shockwave of goosebumps down my arms. "Guide it." Then she reached around me. Her hands didn't push mine away, they covered them. Her palms settled over the backs of my hands, warm and heavy and encompassing. The contrast was shocking. The roughness of her calluses against my smooth skin, the size of her fingers swallowing mine. It was a cage, but it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like an anchor. My breath caught, held hostage in my lungs. I stopped trying to open the box. I stopped trying to do anything other than process the overwhelming sensory input of her skin on mine. She took control, her fingers adjusting the angle of my grip, her thumbs pressing down on top of my thumbs. "Feel the resistance?" she asked, her voice a vibration against my spine. "Yes," I whispered. "I didn't mean the lock." "Lean into it," she instructed. She applied the pressure I had been afraid to use. It wasn't brute force, it was leverage. She used my hands as the extension of her own will, guiding us both into the movement. It was a terrifying surrender of autonomy. I was the expert, the archivist, the one who knew the history, but she was the one making it move. She was the one driving the action. Under the combined weight of our hands, under the heat of her chest pressed against my back, and the absolute certainty of her grip, the brass plate shifted. It was a microscopic movement, a yielding. "There," she breathed. She guided my thumbs in a sharp upward slide. Click. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet studio. The internal tumblers aligned, the deadbolt retracted, and the lid of the rosewood case popped up a fraction of an inch. The seal was broken, the barrier was gone. She didn't let go. For a long heartbeat, we stayed frozen like that. The box unlocked, her hands still clamping mine to the brass, her body molded against my back. The echo of the latch opening faded, but the vibration of it, the physical memory of that release, hummed in the air, heavy and unresolved. Slowly, deliberately, Abigail peeled her hands away from mine. The loss of contact was immediate and jarring, like stepping out of a warm house into a winter gale. The heat that had been pressed against my back receded, leaving my skin prickling and my spine suddenly, vulnerably straight. She took a half step back, creating just enough space for me to breathe, but not enough for me to escape. "Go ahead," she said, her voice rough. "Claim your prize." I reached for the lid. My hands felt light, untethered, without the weight of hers anchoring them. I lifted the heavy rosewood top. It swung back on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing the interior for the first time in decades. The smell of trapped air, stale, vinegary, and dry, wafted up, mixing with the sawdust scent of the shop. I looked inside, and I felt nothing. Resting on the velvet lining was a roll of yellowed paper, brittle with age. I carefully unspooled the edge. Blueprints. Standard industrial lathe, dated 1948. Mundane, utilitarian. "Blueprints," I said, my voice flat. "Industrial machinery." "Standard issue," Abigail noted. She didn't sound surprised. She didn't sound disappointed either. She didn't even lean in to look. I stared at the faded white lines on the blue paper, waiting for the frustration to hit. I had fought for this. I had argued in the street, climbed into a stranger's truck, and let myself be sequestered in a warehouse for this. I should have been annoyed. I should have been calculating the wasted time. But as I looked at the useless paper, the only thing I felt was a soaring, terrifying sense of relief. If the box was empty or worthless, then the transaction was void. The logic of our interaction had just evaporated. There was no treasure to split, no profit to share. The prop we had been using to justify this collision had just been revealed as a fake, which meant the only thing left in the room was the truth we had been diligently ignoring since the flea market. I let the lid drop back down with a soft thud. "Well," I said, turning around to face her, wiping my dusty hands on my jeans to hide their trembling. "That was anticlimactic." Abigail was leaning back against the heavy workbench, her ankles crossed, her arms folded over her chest. The posture pushed her biceps against the dark thermal fabric, highlighting the power I had felt pressing into my back just moments ago. She wasn't looking at the box, she was looking at me, her head tilted slightly to the side, her eyes dark and assessing. "Was it?" she asked. The air in the studio grew heavy again, charged with that same high-frequency vibration I'd felt at the market. But this time, there was no crowd to buffer it, no noise to hide behind. "I expected more," I lied. I walked around the edge of the bench, putting a few feet of distance between us, needing to move to burn off the adrenaline. Given the build quality, the lock mechanism, I thought there would be something of value. "Value is subjective," Abigail said. She pushed off the bench, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. She moved like a predator, not aggressive, but absolutely certain of her terrain. "You didn't fight me for the box because you thought it held the crown jewels. You're an archivist. You knew the odds were 99-1. It was just old paper." I took a calculated risk, I defended, though the argument sounded thin even to my own ears. "You took a risk," she corrected, stepping closer, "but not for the antique." My heart hammered against my ribs. She was stripping away the layers of plausible deniability with the same efficiency she'd used to strip the grime off the wood. "Why did you get in the truck?" she asked softly. "To open the case." "The case is open." She gestured vaguely to the rosewood box without looking at it. "We're done. You can go." But she was standing directly in my path to the door. And she wasn't moving. I stood my ground, lifting my chin. "Is that what you want? For me to go?" Abigail stopped. She was close enough now that I could see the flecks of gold in her dark irises, close enough to smell the coffee and cedar again. She looked at me. Really looked at me in a way that made me feel like I was the one being restored, stripped down to the raw grain. The silence stretched, taut and humming, until it felt like a physical thing pushing against my chest. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let her gaze drop to my mouth, lingering there with a heaviness that made my knees weak before dragging it back up to my eyes. The mask of the casual stranger was gone completely. What was left was something raw, hungry, and frighteningly honest. "I think," she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated through the floorboards, "that we both know the box was just the admission ticket." She took one final step, invading my personal space until she was all I could see. The world narrowed down to the sharp line of her jaw and the intensity of her stare. "You're not looking for blueprints," she murmured, "and I'm not looking for a business partner." She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. Then she looked me dead in the eye, her expression unflinching, and asked the question that shattered the last of my defenses. "Is this what you really want?" She wasn't asking about the antique. She wasn't asking about the blueprints. She was asking about the heat rising in the room, the terrifying proximity, the friction of two lives colliding without a safety net. She was asking if I was brave enough to acknowledge that the pull between us wasn't about history. It was about right now. The silence following her question wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the debris of every excuse I had constructed since the morning. I could have lied. I could have laughed it off, grabbed my bag, and retreated to the safety of the archive, to the quiet, dust-free world where I understood the rules and nothing ever surprised me. But the lie died in my throat. It dissolved under the weight of her gaze, leaving only a raw, terrified honesty that felt like vertigo. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. The air in my lungs had thinned, replaced by the sheer, overwhelming pressure of her presence. Instead, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. A shaky exhale that sounded too loud in the quiet studio. It was an admission. It was a surrender. Abigail saw it. She didn't smile, but her expression shifted. The challenge in her eyes softened into something darker, something intent. She took the answer from the air between us and acted on it. She moved. It wasn't a sudden lunge. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of the remaining distance. She stepped into my personal space, crossing the invisible boundary that separates strangers from lovers, colleagues from something far more dangerous. The effect was visceral. The heat of her body hit me first, a wave of warmth that seemed to radiate through the layers of her clothing and mine, binding us together before we even touched. I stood paralyzed, grounded by the intensity of it. I could smell the reality of her now. Not just the workshop smells of sawdust and varnish, but the underlying scent of her. It was cedar, yes, and that dark coffee note, but beneath that was the scent of warm skin and hard work, a clean, human musk that triggered a primal recognition deep in my brain. It was intoxicating. It made my head swim and my knees feel like they were made of water. She stopped, inches from me, close enough that I could see the fine grain of her skin, the tiny scar above her eyebrow, the way her pupils had dilated until the gold flecks were just thin rings of fire around the black. She was studying my face with the same focus she had given the rosewood, looking for the seams, the joinery, the places where I was held together. Then she reached out. I watched her hand rise in slow motion. It was a worker's hand. Broad, capable, the knuckles slightly swollen from years of labor, the skin tanned and marked by the tools of her trade. It hovered for a fraction of a second near my face, a silent question, giving me one last chance to pull back, to reinstate the boundaries. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Her hand cupped my jaw. The contact was electric, a sudden grounding of a live wire. Her skin was rough, calloused and hard against the softness of my cheek, and the contrast sent a shiver racing down my spine that had nothing to do with cold. It was the friction of texture. The reality of her strength held in check, gentle but undeniable. Her thumb rested on my cheekbone, heavy and warm, anchoring me to the spot. It was the most intimate thing I had ever felt. It wasn't just a touch, it was a claim. It was an acknowledgement that the walls were down. I felt seen in a way that was terrifyingly absolute. There was no hiding the flush rising in my neck, no hiding the rapid pulse that hammered against the skin of my throat, right where her fingers grazed. She could feel it. She could feel the frantic rhythm of my heart, the physical evidence of what she did to me. The fear was real. The fear of the unknown, of the intensity, of how fast we were moving, but the pull was stronger. It was a magnetic force, undeniable and ancient. My internal structural integrity, the careful architecture of my self-control, finally gave way. I leaned into her hand. I closed my eyes and let the weight of my head rest against her palm, surrendering the need to hold myself up. It was a release of tension I hadn't realized I was carrying for years. I pressed my cheek against the roughness of her palm, chasing the friction, needing the grounding reality of her touch to keep me from floating away. Abigail, I whispered, the name feeling strange and heavy on my tongue. "I've got you," she murmured. Her voice was a low rumble in her chest, felt as much as heard. The rest of the world, the flea market, the archive, the traffic outside, the empty rosewood box, fell away completely. The studio walls dissolved into shadow. There was nothing left in the universe but the circle of light from the shop lamp, the smell of pine and desire, and the pulse beating wildly in my throat against the tips of her fingers. She didn't kiss me immediately. That was the most devastating part of her method. In a world accustomed to instant gratification, where desire is usually a frantic, hurried collision, Abigail took her time. She treated the moment with the same deliberate, unhurried patience she applied to the rosewood, respecting the material, understanding the grain, waiting for the right conditions before applying pressure. Her hand remained on my jaw, her thumb continuing that slow, hypnotic sweep across my cheekbone. It was a mapping expedition. She was memorizing the topography of my face, her eyes tracing the line of my lashes, the curve of my nose, the tension I was still holding in the corner of my mouth. I stood frozen under her inspection, my breathing shallow and erratic, while hers remained deep and steady, a rhythmic anchor in the quiet studio. Then her other hand moved. It drifted from her side to the small of my back, the contact firm and authoritative. She didn't hesitate or fumble, she simply claimed the space. Through the thin fabric of my shirt, I could feel the individual pads of her fingers, the heat of her palm branding me. She applied a gentle, steady pressure, pulling me a fraction of an inch closer until our bodies weren't just near each other, but they were aligned. The friction of her canvas pants against my jeans, the solid wall of her chest just brushing mine, created a circuit that hummed with a voltage I hadn't felt in years. "You're trembling," she noted, her voice a low murmur that I felt in my chest as much as I heard. "I'm reacting," I corrected, my voice barely a whisper. She smiled then, a small private expression that didn't reach the rest of the room. She leaned in, closing the final distance slow enough to drive me insane. I could feel the warmth of her breath against my lips, smelling of that dark, rich coffee, and the clean, woodsy scent of the shop. My eyes fluttered shut, my visual sense overwhelmed, leaving me with only the terrifying acuity of touch and sound. When her lips finally brushed mine, it wasn't a demand. It was a question. It was soft, tentative, a testing of the waters. The texture of her lips was surprisingly soft, a contrast that sent a fresh wave of heat through my veins. I leaned into it, answering her question with a pressure of my own, and the hesitation evaporated. The kiss deepened, shifting from an inquiry to a declaration. Her mouth was hot, confident, tasting of anticipation and caffeine. My hands, which had been hanging uselessly at my sides, finally found their purpose. I reached up, gripping the worn cotton of her thermal, shirt at her shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath. It was grounding, real. This wasn't a fantasy, this was physics, action and reaction. The only sounds in the vast, shadowed warehouse were the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the soft rustle of clothing as we moved against each other, and the sharp catch of my breath when her tongue grazed my lower lip. The isolation was absolute. We were the only two people on Earth. She broke the kiss, but didn't pull away. Her forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the small, charged space between us. "You're too far away," she whispered roughly. Before I could process the logistics of that statement, we were literally pressed together. She moved. Her hands shifted to my hips, her grip tightening on my waist. With a grunt of effort that vibrated against my torso, she lifted me. It was effortless, a display of functional strength that made my head spin. For a second, I was weightless, and then she set me down on the edge of the heavy workbench. The shift in elevation changed everything. I was suddenly eye level with her. The power dynamic rebalanced. My legs parted naturally to accommodate her, and she stepped into the space between my knees, moving into the cradle of my body. The solid wood of the bench was hard beneath me, a stark contrast to the yielding warmth of her front. I wrapped my legs around her waist, locking my ankles behind her back, pulling her flush against me. The sense of rightness was overwhelming, like a complex joinery puzzle finally snapping into place. There was no gap left, no room for doubt or hesitation. My hands moved up her neck, sliding into the short, thick hair at the nape. I pulled her back in, hungry for the contact. This time, the kiss was urgent, stripped of the earlier caution. Her hands roamed over my back, exploring the curve of my spine, the dip of my waist, treating my body with the same reverence she showed the antique, but with a fire that wood could never withstand. It was the luxury of pure sensation, the freedom of being handled by someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply to make things hold together, and exactly how much was needed to make them come undone. The light shifted first. The harsh, artificial buzz of the shop lamps had been replaced by a gray, diffuse glow filtering through the high, clear-story windows. It caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning the cavernous workshop into a quiet, suspended snow globe of sawdust and silence. We were sitting on the floor near an old leather sofa that had clearly seen better decades, backs resting against the worn cushions, legs tangled together in a lazy, comfortable disarray. The rosewood drafting case sat on the workbench above us, looming like a silent monolith. It was the reason I was here, technically. But looking at it now, it felt like an artifact from a different life, a prop we had discarded the moment the curtain went up. "So," I said, my voice sounding rough, unused to the quiet. I traced the line of a scar on her forearm, the skin warm and familiar now. "What are we going to do with it?" Abigail took a sip from a mug of fresh coffee she'd brewed on a hot plate in the corner. Black, strong, enough to wake the dead. She looked up at the box, then back down at me. Her hair was messy, sticking up in tufts, and the guarded, sharp-edged stranger from the flea market was nowhere to be seen. In her place was someone softer, though the intensity in her eyes hadn't dimmed. She looked comfortable in the morning light, as solid and real as the oak planks stacked behind her. "The box?" she asked, as if she'd forgotten it existed. "The box. The reason I'm currently sitting on a concrete floor in yesterday's clothes, debating if I can make it to work on time." She hummed, a vibration that traveled from her chest to my shoulder. "It needs work. The veneer is peeling on the back corner. The internal lining is shot. And the lock mechanism? Well, we know that's temperamental. It's empty," I reminded her. "It's a lot of work for an empty box with no provenance." "It's structure," she corrected, shifting so she could look me in the eye. "It's good bones. You don't throw away good bones just because they're empty. You fill them with something else." The metaphor hung in the air between us, heavy and obvious. We weren't talking about rosewood anymore. We were talking about the terrifying, exhilarating emptiness of starting something new, of finding a structure that could hold the weight of what we had just discovered. "I have a project," she said suddenly, setting the mug down on the floor. "A restoration. 1920s library table. Oak. It's a 2-person job. The joinery is a nightmare." I smiled, feeling the pull again, that magnetic drag that had brought me here in the first place. "I'm an archivist, Abigail. I handle paper. I don't do heavy lifting." "You handled the lock," she countered. She reached into the pocket of her discarded jeans on the floor and pulled out a small brass object. It wasn't a tool. It was a key. Not for the box, but for the heavy steel door of the studio. She held it out, not forcing it, just offering it. I can handle the lifting. I need someone who knows how to open things without breaking them. I looked at the key. It was a physical weight, a promise. Taking it meant admitting this wasn't an anomaly. It meant admitting that the friction between us wasn't something to be smoothed over and forgotten, but something to build on. I took the key. The metal was cool against my palm, rapidly warming to my skin temperature. "I'm expensive," I warned, wrapping my fingers around it. "I can afford it," she said, and leaned in to kiss me. Slow, lingering, tasting of coffee and morning breath and promise. Getting dressed felt like a reverse restoration, covering up the raw truth we'd exposed. Leaving the studio felt like stepping off a moving train. The morning air. Outside was crisp, slapping my cheeks, smelling of exhaust and city rain instead of cedar and sex. But as I walked toward the subway, the weight of the key in my pocket was a grounding anchor. I wasn't just walking away, I was commuting between two worlds. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing the sanctuary, but the hum of the workshop stayed in my blood. I had gone looking for a dead antique to catalog and file away. Instead, I found a pulse. I found a structure with good bones and room to grow. If you've ever gone searching for one thing and found exactly what you actually needed, subscribe to see where this construction project goes next.